Good evening, everybody. My name is James Grierson, and I'm a member of the York Consortium for Conservation and Craftsmanship Committee, and I'm a trustee of the charitable foundation that is also controlled through the consortium. And it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome all of you to the first of what promises to be a series of regular second Tuesday seminars. Now, a few weeks ago, we were due to hold our annual general meeting and annual lecture as a live event. And of course, that didn't take place. And instead, we had a seminar with 4 principal speakers, which went incredibly well. It was a very large audience, drawn from all corners of the world, to our great surprise. And nearly 3/4 of the people that joined in on that last occasion were not members of the consortium. So we have a large audience this evening, and just in case it's the same sort of breakdown, I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about the consortium before we start with our webinar. The consortium was established 20 years ago in recognition of York's unusual role as a real hub for conservation and heritage craft skills. And we were formed in order to build on that, to emphasize the close integration of conservation, the work of conservators and the work of craftspeople, and to provide a real focus for practitioners and other people interested in supporting our heritage. This year, I'm pleased to say we made our 250th bursary to support the development of craft and conservation skills. Now, this evening, I'm delighted to welcome as our principal speaker, Bethan Griffiths of the Ironwork Studio.
Hi, everyone.
Bethan will give us a presentation on fitting the old to the new, designing new ironwork for heritage settings. And after Bethan's talk, we shall be opening things up in conversation between Bethan and 2 distinguished visiting experts. First, Rhys Brooks.
Good evening, everyone.
Rhys is an architect specialising in conservation projects, and his experience encompasses many important listed buildings as well as traditionally constructed new buildings. Now, we're also going to be joined by Adrian Nielsen, who will come in a little while. He's not with us yet. Adrian trained as an archaeologist, then worked as a heritage consultant before taking responsibility for the care of Bath's incredible heritage as the city's senior conservation officer. But turning back to Bethan, Bethan is a leading designer and consultant specialising in decorative architectural ironwork. Her work can be found in World Heritage sites, museums, cathedrals, conservation areas, Grade 1 listed buildings. All incredibly exacting environments for which nothing but the highest quality of work is good enough. Now, she recorded her presentation a little bit earlier just to insulate us from the vagaries of her internet connection, but the conversation session afterwards is definitely coming to you live. And if you have questions that you'd like Beth and Adrian or Rhys to address in the conversation, do please write them in the chat function, not in the Q&A bit, but in the chat function, and we'll answer as many as we can afterwards. Now, we expect to finish at about 8 o'clock, but if there are outstanding questions, for those who wish to stay, we may carry on for a few minutes afterwards. Finally, do please bear with us as we deal with the webinar technology, and bear in mind that this talk is being recorded. Thank you. Bethan.
Hello, everyone. This talk is titled Fitting the New to the Old. It's about design, or more specifically, designing new work for heritage settings. The aim is to give insight into the considerations that are needed when working in this context. Conservation within heritage settings is a very large topic, and there's a lot of information and guidance to digest. To condense this into half an hour, I'm of course going to be brief and very selective about the points I cover. We have a mixed audience, so I'm going to start by briefly outlining the foundation on which all work within heritage settings is built. Here we have an image within Ely Cathedral's historic Lady Chapel showing a new contemporary installation. The reasons why projects like this are acceptable is captured by this quote from Historic England. Change to historic assets is inevitable, but it is only harmful when significance is damaged. This very neatly sums up 2 key foundation blocks to new work within historic settings. The first is that new work is not prohibited. Heritage settings are not just conserved as they are indefinitely. We can change things within the setting, and this is possible for several reasons. Maintenance is one, adaptation another. Adaptation ensures practicality and meaningfulness for the people who use the heritage. This is how these places become sustainable. So change and adaptation are an essential ingredient to making sure heritage settings are sustainable in the long term. The second key point is that any change must be done without damaging significance. The point is that any change or adaptation must positively enhance significance rather than damage it. Achieving this is dependent on understanding what significance is. Conservation principles are therefore a fundamental requirement. This may seem strange given we are talking about new work, but in a nutshell, conservation principles are the foundation of understanding historic significance. They give you a knowledge of what you need to be recognising, valuing and preserving. However, conservation principles are really about how you manage change, the practical conservation that is carried out. This of course applies to repairing work, but it equally applies to any other change. Hence, conservation principles are not specific to repair work, but about all work, and therefore a fundamental requirement. Without understanding and applying them, you risk damage to significance. Designing new work within a heritage setting is not an isolated activity. Existing policy framework and guidance must be taken into consideration. This is important because to gain permission for your proposal, you must demonstrate how it conforms to planning frameworks. These frameworks come at international, national and local levels, so there can be a little variation depending on the exact location. Naturally, these policies limit the possibility of what is acceptable. They provide a boundary that proposals need to fit within. To me, this is a positive as it focuses attention on what fits. As for design guidance, I'm now going to cover my personal key points. Achieving designs that fit within the planning boundary need not be complicated or difficult. The following is the briefest of introductions to just 5 key points. It's not an exhaustive list, but personally, I believe that keeping these in mind is crucial to get any design process started in the right direction. First is character. Here we have an image of Great Pulteney Street, Bath, where if stood in it, you can't help but be immersed in its character. When it comes to design, this quote from Rhys Brooks really sums up what character is about. The architectural context or landscape is your client, as much the client as the person commissioning the work. In other words, an assessment of the character of a setting is critical in establishing a good design brief and the aesthetic direction for new work. In the case of heritage settings, the brief must come from the surroundings, and you must respond to this for both conservation work and new work. Good design picks up on the architectural conversation. Bad design ignores it and as a result becomes argumentative. Second, significance and value. The ability to recognise and value historic significance is fundamental. Significance can, for example, be in relation to a specific object or a streetscape, or even in association with a person or event. It's a sum of technological, historical, aesthetic, or social values for past, present, or future generations. The key points are that first, it provides information on which informed decisions can be made. Second, you can't design sympathetically without understanding it, yet it does not in itself dictate the design direction. Third, response to setting. Is your response design or proposed design good, bad, or indifferent? A key ingredient to this is how it responds to its setting, the context the proposal sits within. Responding to a setting is about achieving a design that reinforces rather than detracts from significance. Storytelling is how I like to see this. Your ability to tell a story is important because it's through the story behind your design and what it represents that the proposal will be evaluated. Fourth, sympathetic design. Now, this is the most commonly referenced, yet also the most misinterpreted concept. But what does it mean? Should new work be in keeping with the traditional styles as per the traditional gate here? Or is not in keeping acceptable with a contemporary approach as with the circular design? The most misunderstood point is that sympathetic does not necessarily mean traditional. Either response can be valid. But why is this? The reason is because good practice states that new work should be easily identifiable. The new altar and rear screen at Ely Cathedral aesthetically obviously follows this rule. With the new lantern and arch at Great Pulteney Street, Bath, it is not visually obvious but identifiable by more subtle clues like the discrete date stamp. Both examples follow best practice. Both are sympathetic designs. Remember, good new work equals sympathetic design. Sympathetic design is a catch-all phrase, not a specific design direction. There is no right or wrong design direction. It is a decision that needs to be assessed on an individual basis. Replicating a particular style can be completely the right choice in one context, yet absolutely not in another. Remember, quality design and how it relates to its context is what makes a sympathetic design, not whether or not it is replicating a particular style. Today I'm talking about the quality of design, but do also remember quality is in terms of craftsmanship and materials. That, however, is a topic for another day. Finally, my fifth point, impact and enhancement. When working on an ironwork project, it's all too easy to see it as an isolated object. It's important to remember to evaluate it both aesthetically and practically to its overall setting. This is because evaluation of the impact of the design and the value it adds is essential to gaining planning permission. This new bandstand at Roberts Park, Saltaire is no shrinking violet. It's a focal feature which doubles as a facility for live music, providing a visual and practical enhancement to park life. The new handrail to the Whispering Gallery at St. Paul's Cathedral also provides a practical enhancement, but aesthetically it enhances for the opposite reason of the bandstand, by blending into its setting. Here is a recap of my 5 points. Up to now, I've in essence followed the established guidance, which you'll find in any publication on new work in heritage settings. However, am I right in suspecting you're still unclear on which design direction, in keeping or not in keeping? It's hard, isn't it? So how do you solve the initial objective of establishing a design direction? My personal approach can be illustrated as a simple framework. The starting point comes from the 4 categories: restoration, repair, addition and alteration, and works for research alone, which are defined in Historic England's publication, Characteristics of Change to Heritage Assets. There are the two relevant ones are highlighted in blue and green: restoration and addition. For the context of this talk, I'm going to define these. Restoration is about the reinstatement of missing elements of decoration, restoring the former appearance, interior or streetscape. Do not confuse repair and restoration, although the terms are used interchangeably. The definition of repair here is that it is the physical repair of a specific object, so not what we are talking about today. With addition and alteration, the focus is on managing change. It is about adding new original designs that add value and interest to the history of a place by telling their own story. It views additions as just one phase in the timeline of a property's development. Here I have adapted Historic England's framework to create my own. The subheadings enable better understanding. Projects may not neatly fit into a specific category, but that isn't the point. Instead, the intention of this framework is simply to give a starting point so that the process of analysis and assessment can get underway. Also, it's important to recognise that in historic settings, contemporary design cannot be looked at in isolation. Therefore, this overview includes the full picture so that an informed decision can be made. For the remainder of this talk, I'm going to go through each subheading, illustrating it with case studies. So I start with Restore Historic Design. This is about direct reproduction of an original period design. It relies on high quality evidence of what was once there, so is only relevant where there are references available to make an exact copy. For example, physical remains or archive images. Weston Park, South East Gates, Sheffield. The image on the left is an old postcard giving historic evidence of the gates that were stolen. On the right is a detail of their replacement. Restoring a historical design is dependent on two things. First, good evidence of the design concept. It must be reasonably clear. Second, expert knowledge for detail, be it design or construction. If not, then you risk a poor pastiche. However, the question is, why choose to reinstate the gates when you could have a new design? The story, of course, starts with an appraisal of my 5 key points. The character of the overall setting, where, in this instance, just one item, the gates, is missing. The significance of the entrance, the individual items, and the fact it was once a formal entrance to a grand house. Regards response to setting, will an informed restoration or a new design best reinforce the significance of the entrance and character as a whole? I think we can all agree a restoration approach in this case is sympathetic. As for enhancement, a restoration allows the entrance to be viewed as originally intended, which enhances the whole. Recreating period style. This is about imitating a period fashion. It is used in situations where you do not have an original design to copy. It therefore relies on historical reference material to inform the design process. It is relevant where the majority of the original historic features are present with only a specific element lost. It is important to distinguish the recreation of a period style from the previous example of restoration. This is so that all decision makers understand they are commissioning a modern interpretation of a period style as opposed to an authentic historic design. Barnes Park, Sunderland. As per the previous case study, the original entrance is complete apart from the gates. The gates you can see here are modern replacements. They are cheaply fabricated in a bad state of corrosion and have no historic significance. Based on this, a decision was made not to repair them. So the difference here is that there is no evidence of the original gate design. So it could be argued that a new design would be appropriate. However, in evaluating my 5 key points, the client came to the same conclusion as the last project. They believed, with just one element missing to the original entrance, the best enhancement was to have it viewed as originally intended. This is an encouraging case study, as achieving this need not be difficult. These images are after the project was completed, but clearly illustrate the design references. On the left, we have an image of the refurbished but original railings. On the right, details of the new gate. I've used 2 design responses to inform my proposal. Firstly, I've worked with the existing known design elements, the railings. You can clearly see where I have copied my design references from, although I've used them differently. Secondly, I've used my knowledge of appropriate period design and construction to give it authenticity. It is this, after all, that stops it being a poor pastiche. Here you can see the finished results, giving an overview of the context. Now for addition and alteration. Starting with heritage inspired, another name I use for it is in the spirit of. That's because it's about using the style and ethos of a specific period as inspiration. You need to understand the spirit of the era you are designing in. The difference to the contemporary is that heritage inspired responds directly to historical references. Done correctly, it has the potential to achieve a timeless feel, which is, it isn't trend-led. The case study here is a new entrance for Shrewsbury Cathedral. The stairs and balustrade are new. This is clearly a major alteration as a practical adaptation to address access requirements. Prior to intervention, the congregation exited straight through the central porch directly onto the road, whereas now they split into two groups going left and right. In this case, the practicalities of improving the congregation's safety outweighed the heritage significance of the original entrance. But now the question is there anything for reference for the new design? In my attempt to respond to the setting, I found little reference outside, so instead I looked inside. If you're anything like me, then you'll find it's a wonderful perk of the job, being paid to poke your nose around these fascinating places. So here is some of the reference material I found. You'll notice there is no ironwork shown, and that's because I didn't find any appropriate references. However, these images clearly represent the infamous Gothic style of the cathedral's architect, E.W. Pugin, and using them as my reference has the double benefit of also reinforcing the religious link to the cathedral itself. Look at the two images on the right. There were many variations of these pointed quatrefoils throughout the interior. These became the inspiration for my design, as you will see in the next image. Here is the final design in which you can clearly see the pointed quatrefoils. I trust you now see how this design relates to the cathedral itself. I've been inspired by the motif, but I haven't directly copied it. Instead, I've simplified it and made it bold. In doing so, I've created a unique contemporary piece, inspired by its context. In essence, it is a modern abstract take on a traditional religious Gothic motif. If you're wondering about the colour, the blue is it represents the Virgin Mary to whom the cathedral is dedicated. So what about impact and enhancement? Here we have an image of the final installation. It obviously provided much needed practical enhancement. As for visually, the design needed to be something befitting of a cathedral's main entrance. I was only adding the decoration to the architect's concept, but I trust together we accomplish this. In this case study, we're looking at LUCKNAM Park Hotel in Wiltshire. So another entrance where the stonework is complete but the ironwork missing. The question this time, though, is, should all ironwork be restored? We know what was there, as shown by the archive photo. However, it is possible to evaluate it and make a case for not restoring it. In this example, I'm going to evaluate it on 2 points. First, quality of the evidence. Look at the clarity of the image. In other words, there's quite a bit of conjectural detail that would be needed to reinstate this scheme. Second, artistic merit. In this instance, you could say it lacks artistic merit. Another way of saying it wasn't very good in the first place. So in this example, the decision was taken not to restore the ironwork. This is the completed entrance after refurbishment. My design has a strong traditional feel. It's obviously influenced by traditional styles, yet it is modern at the same time. As for impact, it follows the layout and scale of the original work. Regards enhancement, it completes the view and is what you'd expect of a formal front entrance. In other words, it simply enhances the experience of entering this grand property. Taking a closer look, it doesn't take an expert to recognise this is not an authentic traditional design. It understands and responds to the language and style of traditional work, but it is a fresh take, as emphasised by the decorative detailing. It responds to its setting by being a blend of old and new. It also adds to the story as it incorporates a fleur-de-lis as reference to the French owners. Contemporary. This is about not being bound to specific historic references. If done well, it creates a dialogue between ancient and modern that lifts the value and meaning of both. Roberts Park, Saltaire, which is a World Heritage Site. The proposal here was for a new bandstand. There are two key evaluation points. First, music performances are an integral part of park life, so reinstatement would be a practical enhancement. Second, nothing remained of the original bandstand but historic images. It was very modest, and given the exceptional character of Saltaire Village, an attempt to reconstruct it was not considered appropriate. Third, this was seen as an opportunity to restore a focal point within the park by creating a unique centrepiece, something befitting a World Heritage Site. In responding to the setting, the theme for the new bandstand came from these images. In the architecture of Saltaire, there are flowers everywhere. They were seen as a fitting link between the architecture and the park. The sketches you see came from a community consultation workshop with children. Look closely and you'll see there are musical instruments blowing out flowers and leaves. Linking nicely together flowers, foliage and musical instruments, this became the theme. Here are some detailed shots of the finished bandstand. On the right, you can see the capital designs. They're all different and very stylized, but if you look closely, you will see. The one at the front is harps with shamrocks growing out of the strings. The next one back is violins and maple. And the one at the back, trumpets with a flower being blown out. On the left, the theme is carried into the railings, although even more abstract. You can still see trumpets, flowers and leaves. And here, the overall completed bandstand. This project is Sound Waves in Stockton-on-Tees. It's not what you might think of when trying to get planning permission in heritage setting. It's in a Grade 2 listed conservation area. Images on the left are before and those on the right after. This project highlights that not all heritage work has good historic reference material for inspiration, as you can see in the before images. The design I came up with is abstract, the circular design representing sound waves. But this is a direct response to the setting. It connects the two buildings by reflecting their current use. Both are music venues. As for impact, they certainly provide an attractive, enhanced experience to those passing and using the venues. This case study is a complete new build within a conservation area. It's Carnaby Street, London. The new building on the left abuts the old painting one on the other side. My gate is in the middle with a close-up of the detail in the right-hand image. Again, appropriate visual design references were scant. So instead, my design response is to the significance of the location, with Carnaby Street being the iconic birthplace of the swinging 60s. This design is inspired by the bold geometric patterns of the 60s. As for impact, to be honest, given the vibrancy of Carnaby Street, it's hardly noticeable. And for my final case study, we end with the altar and reredos screen at Ely Cathedral. In this project, I worked with the designer John Madison. My role was to not only provide technical help in turning his concept into a reality, but at the same time ensure it embodied honest craftsmanship in its construction. This design neatly sums up my final point here of respect, respond, and enhance. Respect the significance. Here, the significance is the remnants of carvings on the wall behind the reredos that were defaced during the Reformation. This is an important part of the cathedral's history. Respond. The design responds to these carvings by including what is left of them in the design. It doesn't obscure or hide them. Enhance. The design frames the carvings. It makes them a focal point. By doing this, it enhances their presence rather than distracting from them. In fitting the new to the old, remember, respect, respond, and enhance. As I said earlier, good work equals sympathetic design. That is in terms of design, craftsmanship, and materials. Only time will tell as times and fashions change, but get it right and you will have created heritage of the future. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed the talk.
Bethan, thank you very, very much for that. That's absolutely fascinating. And I think the sort of the clarity of the way you've described it, but also the wonderful examples you've given, it certainly makes me want to commission something. I don't need anything, but I'd like to think of something. Anyway, we are now due to have a conversation session. I think we've got technical problems that is keeping Adrian out of the conversation for a little while. Whether he manages to join us in a few minutes or not, we'll just proceed with Rhys and Bethan. Perhaps though, just to begin with, Rhys, you could explain a little bit about the role of a conservation architect and actually how you might work with a designer.
Yes, thank you, James. Well, first and foremost, I think a lot of people don't really understand what architects do in the first place, and it might be worth just spending a few minutes just discussing what we actually do. We basically go through a 7-year process of training, which is intended to equip us to take a client's brief, which may be just an idea, and bring that to fruition. It's a long process. It takes 7 years to train, basically because there are so many different aspects that you have to consider. Ultimately, we are sort of, I suppose you could call us like the fat controllers. We should know everything that's actually, every decision that's made in producing a building, whether it be a garden shed up to a city. You know, that's basically our role. However, conservation architect is different because unlike a modern building where you start off with a blank piece of paper and a client's brief, we often have a thing that we have to deal with, an actual building. And so what we have to do is effectively unpick that building. We almost have to be, if you like, detectives to go back to understand why that building is the way it is, what decisions were made literally by the original architect or designers, to get a real understanding of how it's put together and its story. So in some ways, the analogy, best analogy would be like going to see a doctor. So a doctor obviously had a lot of training, but ultimately they're confronted with a patient and they have to put that training into practice. And one of the best ways of doing that is getting a case history of the person they're examining. So we often look forwards and backwards, and we have to bring the two together. So we'll have a client on one side saying, I'd like to change this building to be X, Y, and Z. And then there's me saying, well, hang on, you know, the building isn't going to allow you to do that because there's certain restrictions in terms of actually how the fabric's put together or whatever it happens to be. So in that sense, I suppose we have sort of two sides to our skill set. We have this sort of detective role and this understanding role. At the end of the day, dealing with a historic building, I want to be in a position where I know as much about that historic building as the person who did the original design. And it's only then I feel that I can make an informed decision, which isn't going to cause that building damage, and also pull together what the client wants to make sure that the two fit. So I guess in essence, that's what we do.
Thank you, Rhys. Now, at this point, I was going to ask Adrian to explain in a similar fashion the role of the conservation officer. And
Shall I tell you what he
him,
does?
would you like to do that? Because you'll have seen it through the other end of the telescope many times.
They do nothing really, to be honest with you. No, in all seriousness, their role is very specific. They obviously lots of legislation is in place to protect historic buildings, and they're a finite asset. So, you know, once they've gone, they've gone. So they do need a lot of protection, and the conservation officer's real role is to ensure they're they are carefully handled and respected, and that they're not, no damage comes to them, and if possible, he or she would like to see them enhanced and their setting enhanced. So the listed building isn't just the actual building. A lot of people think it's just what's on the list description. It's everything in the building, every fitting, every fixture, even all the garden walls, whatever else happens to be surrounding the building. It's quite an extensive thing. So a lot can go wrong, and the conservation officer's role there is really to ensure that no damage comes to that building.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you very much. Now, I think we're ready now to move on to questions from the audience, and hand over to Bethan at this point.
Thank you, James. Okay, and hi, Rhys. Quite looking forward to this conversation and finding out things from your perspective. It looks like we're going to have to fill in a bit for Adrian as well, though. So, as for the delegates, you're able to send your questions in via text, and we've already had some in, and I'm able to read them on the side or in the chat bar. And so I'm going to take the first one now and see if we can answer that. Does a conservation officer have the authority to make choices on a personal preference? Well, we could have done with Adrian, couldn't we?
We could have done with Adrian. But I can answer for him because I've had many arguments with him about this, or discussions, I should say, more accurately. The bottom line is no. Personal preference doesn't come into it. They work very much from fact, and sometimes it may appear to be personal preference because the facts which are being presented to them are ambiguous. So, for example, if you can't demonstrate why something is being done, their natural default is to say no, because obviously they're there to protect the building. So I think, to be honest with you, personal preference thing, I've never really known a conservation officer make a personal preference. Some of the perhaps less experienced ones may make slightly uninformed decisions, but those aren't really personal preferences, and you can contest them. I think that's, if they say, well, this is what I think, just say, well, hang on. It's not about what you think. It's about, are we doing damage to the building?
The main point is with that one is that if you took two completely different people and put them into the same, to make a decision on the same job, they should, two different conservation officers without any communication should come to the same decision. They follow a format. They
should do, but obviously it's down to individuals to a degree and experience, like anything in life, but the legislation which they are abiding by is very, very clear. So if the decisions are wayward, you just have to challenge them on the basis of the legislation. You say, well, hang on, where in the legislation does it say that I can't do this? Or, what's your reasoning for saying no? But more often than not, the onus is really upon the applicant to make a good argument. If you make a poor argument, the argument coming back the other way is also going to be poor. If you make a very good argument, then the answers generally are going to be favourable. So just do your homework and know your stuff. And if you do that, then generally the answers coming back will be positive.
Okay, seems fine. Yeah, so basically they're following a set of guidance. So it should, a personal preference shouldn't come into it, that one. Question number, we've got a thing from Katie who's saying, Katie is admin for tonight, for the rest of you who don't know. She wants me to remind you that if you should see a Q&A button along the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, hover your cursor down there and it'll come up. And that's where you can type your questions in, any questions you want to ask us this evening. Question number 2. The presentation pointed out that new work within heritage settings is not prohibited. However, is there not a bias towards a traditional approach? I don't think there is a bias towards that, but Rhys, would you like to give a bit more view?
Is there a bias towards the traditional approach in so much as...
Would it be more preferable, do conservation officers not actually, or conservation settings, I'm not going to blame it on the conservation officer, we've just had that actually has got no preference, but is it not easier to put, if I've got conservation setting and I put a design forward, is it not easier for me to choose a traditional design to put forward because it's going to be far more straightforward and go through? So is there not a bias towards that rather than contemporary? I think that's where the question's coming from.
Generally, no. I'd say sometimes I think you mentioned it in your presentation, sometimes there is a danger that a traditional approach can be confusing because it can be a little bit of a pastiche, or somebody perhaps doesn't have all the information to make an informed series of decisions. And in sort of that instance, a more contemporary approach would often be preferred. And in fact, Historic England quite often would say, actually, let's make it look different, but still with some sort of tangible relationship to, as you put out in your lecture, some tangible relationship to the actual setting. So it's not always going to be, oh no, we want it exactly as it was originally. You just have to make a good argument. And sometimes I find that actually it's easier to do a modern interpretation because it is not confusing. You know, it is what it is. It's, you know, it's an addition, which is acceptable.
I was just going to interrupt and say that actually, if you're going to go down a traditional approach, then it can be more difficult because you do have to know that best practice is to say that it is identifiable as a new addition. And if it's too close in style, you have to be extra careful. And there can be judgments on that it isn't, seeing it as a new piece is too subtle. So a more obvious new intervention can sometimes be better.
That's right. I think the other thing you've got to remember that conservation officers is, I view it very simplistically. I mean, because I'm quite simple the way I think about things, but I generally think that, you know, things which are additive to a historic setting are actually not generally problematic, especially for a conservation officer, because you can always take them away again. But if you take something away, it's gone forever. So as a result, conservation officers are very, very concerned about things just, you know, being removed because, you know, you have to be very, very justified in removing something. But something which is added is usually is part of the history and the evolution of a building quite often. You know, if we stuck with what we had sort of 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, we wouldn't have any changes to any buildings at all. So of course you can add stuff to buildings and it can be contemporary. There's nothing to suggest that it can't be. The key will come as if it becomes something which is in conflict with the original fabric, so that it in some ways doesn't enhance the original fabric, but actually is seen to be in some way visually damaging or contrasting, so it's a subtle thing. And that's where the skill of a designer comes in, really. That's where your skills really come to play as a designer, to make sure the thing just meshes together nicely.
Yeah, and again, back to a number of the points I covered, but with it being a bias for traditional, I think actually, I know one of the things that Adrian would say on that, and he says, he has told me before that he has, one of his jobs actually is often having to convince architects and developers to actually be original enough, you know, not to do traditional just because it's a conservation area, but to be original and put something new in there. You know, so he doesn't see this bias. He thinks that's a myth.
I agree. Yeah.
Right, next question. In contrast to contemporary design proposals, are traditional solutions more straightforward? I think we've actually just touched on some of this, so I'm going to jump in here, if you don't mind. I don't think they are necessarily more straightforward because with a traditional design, it still has to be identifiable as a new installation against the old work. So it's not actually straightforward in that, because, you know, you do have to have that ability to identify it so that somebody doesn't mistake it as something that's 100 or 200 years old like the rest of the fabric.
Yeah, as you say, the question is almost a repeat of the first question. I mean, in essence, you know,
I think we've covered it, haven't we?
Yeah, I think we have covered it. Yeah,
we have covered it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look down to the next one. Right, so this one's, oh, we have some names now. Sarah Brown. You mentioned the importance of character in your opening statements. How do you handle an urban setting that has changed in response to new communities, new character?
Oh, that's a good question. Nice one. Well, of course, you know, characters do change, and historic. If you look at a historic fabric, it's, you know, it's constantly moving, constantly evolving. Buildings disappear, new buildings go up. You know, things get reconfigured, etc. I think that the key with any designer is, you know, you're not trying to go back to necessarily a sort of set period of time or anything like that. What conservation officers in particular are looking for you to do is to read the context of your environment. So I know, for example, Adrian often gets very frustrated with people designing in Bath, and they will cite, I don't know, the Royal Crescent as being, oh, we've just picked, you know, the Royal Crescent as our precedent, and we're going to design a building like that one. And where you may be in an industrial part of Bath, which means that, you know, citing the Royal Crescent as your precedent is completely illogical. What you need to be doing is feeding from the crumbs around you, and sometimes they're quite diverse, and they're not set in any period of time. So it's really stitching all the bits together, which is very important. So the idea of a changing urban setting is actually very, very exciting. And you can contrast to that, of course. You know, maybe you think, well, it's very fragmented anyway, so what you're going to be adding is not necessarily going to be any more divergent than the bits that are already there. Or you can try and stitch bits together, but that's where the skill of the designer comes in. But if you just do it willfully, just say, well, that's what I wanted to do, you know, that's going to be shot down in flames by the conservation officer, because they need to understand your logic as to why you are arriving at that solution. They need to know the backstory, basically.
Yeah, I don't have many in my presentation that refer to this, but I think Carnaby Street is probably the nearest. The changing character there. It was Carnaby Street is, you know, very well established. It's very old, and yet the building, they knocked down what was there. There was actually 3 building plots, and they put a brand new building up. And again, it's weird, you take your reference, and obviously Carnaby Street's very vibrant, very different along it. And I just kept, you know, having walked down the street and gone, you know, so this could be any setting, couldn't it? You visit the area, you have a look round, and you see, in essence, what's coming through, what possibilities there are. And through going through the brief, you can actually start working out which is the strongest and which one is the most setting for that place, because you might have a few different options to go along, mightn't you? You know, if the character is changing, I think is what it said.
Absolutely. And in some ways, being an architect sort of working predominantly in Bath, it's incredibly boring, because you just don't get the fertility, you just don't get the diversity. And sometimes you crave the diversity, you know, different materials, you know, different styles of architecture. So, you know, that's exciting, I'd say, to answer Sarah's question directly. That's really exciting. Grab it with both hands and run with it. But, you know, you've got to make some argument for why you're doing it, because obviously you're going to have to effectively stand up in front of somebody and say, conservation officer, say, I'm doing this because of X, Y, and Z. It has to be defendable. It has to be born out of the environment rather than born out of necessarily sort of whimsical imagination.
So therefore you can, you know, there might be several different characters from different time periods to choose from, but you can choose one of them as long as you can put a good story behind it. It is reasonably likely to be.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one. Adam Vaughan. Bethan, with reference to your case studies, how do you use different materials in different settings, e.g. wrought iron and steel? How do I use different materials? Oh, I just, it's easy because I just use the one that's right for me at the time. I look at the properties. We can look at the budget. In Shrewsbury Cathedral, for instance, I used cast iron. It was my first entire cast iron job. I've used cast iron in lots of jobs, but not in entirety like that. And part of that was budget. It also linked nicely to the period, you know, the mid 1800s that we are coming from, referencing with the cathedral when that was built. Because cast iron very much came into its own then at that period. It was very fashionable. So, but it suited the budget of the project, and it also suited, you know, the design. Whether I use wrought iron, I tend to use, wrought iron's more expensive, and I only use it really, if I get a choice, in outdoor situations where you need the properties, the weathering material properties of it. But in a lot of jobs, obviously, it is mild steel and it is protected with zinc, either galvanized or hot zinc sprayed in some way.
I should say
a lot will come down to budget.
I should say that, of course, that in terms of conservation officers or conservation practice, you've got a finite resource like raw time, so you tend to use it very, very sparingly. I think quite often what we're trying to look at is techniques. So, welded steel has a very different feel to forged steel. So there's that is an additional element to it, So I think
that's very true. That's taking it off material as such, but yes, it's the technique. You're right. Actually, the question maybe should be framed more towards techniques. That's a good point. And yes, using raw tin is there's a small supply of it, so it does have to be used in circumstances which truly suit it. Not I wouldn't by any means want to use it in every single project. It wouldn't be right.
We only ever specify it for where you have to do a repair on a like-for-like basis. It's usually something very important.
Yes, but definitely the majority of the uses in. It's very. I do get the odd client who may want a new project in it, but it's not many. Should we move on to the next one? Joe Tyler, if you were to restore something from a heritage site that does not conform with building regulations, are you able to compromise to make it safer, or is the historic design always protected? I think that's the full question.
Okay. This is there's obviously, I've just read the question as well. There's a related sub bit to that. What happens if somebody gets injured? The building regulate. I mean, obviously, we have a duty of care as architects to make sure that people don't get injured, and fall off things, etc. But there's also a degree of common sense that's applied, and building regulations, are always changing. So what was relevant 3 years ago may not be relevant now. It's a constantly moving thing. So what I do today, 10 years time may be illegal. I just don't know. So as a consequence, and because heritage settings are, a heritage building or a listed building or an ancient monument are very finite. They actually can be exempt from certain building regulations. Most of them, in fact, they're exempt from. So you'd have to be going some way to actually, I mean, these things have been around for hundreds of years, and people, have to have a duty of care and understand that they're not like a modern building, and generally speaking, they do. So, you're not going to put handrails around Stonehenge, or, it's just, it would be nonsensical.
My experience of it is that I'm not asked whether a design is suitable for building regs. I am actually brought in and being told we need to get this design more in line with building regulations. So sometimes it's about heightening a handrail on a balustrade. Other times the gap is quite large, far more than 100 gaps on a balustrade, and we're putting, a framework in between or something like that. But I must admit, I tend to come in and I have been told that it's a problem, and can I come up with a design to get around it?
It does depend very much on the situation. I mean, sometimes it's easiest just to set the conservation officer and the building control officer onto each other, so see who comes out on top. But generally speaking, I mean, you have to be pragmatic. I mean, if you've obviously got sort of children sort of walking around a high-level balustrade, then you may have to think, well, that's, it's a bit dicey. But common sense prevails, generally speaking, and obviously on a lot of the grade 1 listed buildings we work on, the conservation officer just basically trumps the listed buildings, the building control officer, and says, well, sorry, this is a protected building, and your remit doesn't cover this, because of course it covers new work. Building regulations is for new work predominantly, so only if you
I think the ones that I've come in and done are more where the building is in heavy use by the public.
Mm.
So they've got a heavy public footfall, coming through, and they just want a bit better security.
Well, I mean, that's, as I say, that's common sense, and sometimes you can use that as a design opportunity to add something. If it's additive to the existing railings, let's say, for example, or you do something which is actually very transparent, then again, the conservation officer may not be, you can solve both problems, satisfy the conservation officer and satisfy the building control officer. A degree of common sense needs to be applied. It's a lot of risk assessment needs to be done. So, you know, we have something at the moment which we're dealing with, which is 64 streetlights, cast iron streetlights, which the Highways Agency have said are dangerous, and there's a likelihood that they'll fall and kill somebody. And when we asked him how many instances there were of that in the last 10 years, he said there are about 4. So I said, well, how many streetlights are in the UK? And he said, well, it's about 30 million or something ridiculous like that. So, you know, when you start looking at it statistically, you know, so the argument was basically what we said was, well, we'll take out insurance. And actually that's what the town council did, to get insurance for the 1 in a million chance that this streetlight may fall down. So, I mean, it's just assessing risk. Sometimes, you know, the default of an officer may be to try and protect, because that's the job, of course. And this is sort of the building regulations.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Adam Bench, what metal workers or designers have inspired you? Do you like Louis Osman, Carlos
Scarpa, yeah.
Peter Behan, Joseph
Hoffman, yeah.
And are you inspired by arts and crafts artists like? Personally, none of those are on my top list. And I haven't thought of a question like this. Who inspires me? I have lots of people. I keep an eye out on work all the time. And as a young designer, I definitely could have just said X, Y, and Z immediately off the top of my head. But what I've come into, the more I've worked with heritage, the more I've been inspired by it, and the more I'm in awe of it, actually, because I started my career thinking heritage was a bit dumb and boring. You know, I came out of university as a contemporary designer, inspired along that route, and came into heritage later. But I very, very much like the arts and crafts. It is one of my favourite periods, actually, on that. And I do like the work of Ernest Gibbs very much. Rhys, do you have any inspiration?
I love Carlos Scarpa. But then again, you know, I mean, some of the work they did was fantastic. You know, really, really simple and clean and wonderful. But
yeah,
you know,
I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you.
No.
This one. We're going to move on. We are getting close to time, so I think we'll ask another question and then see how many more there are. Because and after the question, we'll check the time again. When is it important to call upon an archaeologist or historic buildings / heritage consultant to realise the client's needs? And a related question: why is it that specialist ironwork designers, blacksmiths, are frequently not included in the design stages of a project? Okay, so let's go to the first one. When is it important to call upon an archaeologist or historic buildings consultant to realise the client's needs? I think that's more for you, Rhys.
It depends on what the client is doing, for a start, or wants to do. So if they're doing pretty much nothing, then of course you don't need don't need our expertise. If the client is doing something very subtractive, so taking some elements of the building away or doing some alterations which involve some addition and some subtraction, then that's definitely when we would need to be involved, and we would work quite closely with archaeologists. Obviously archaeologists deal with stuff generally below ground, although not always, and we tend to deal with stuff above ground. But if it's just an addition to something, then quite often we may not be involved at all. You know, it's just, you know, might be something that just gets done by the client and a directly appointed, you know, specialist.
I was just wondering about this question, if it related to just installing a pair of gates or just installing a handrail or balustrade. You might not need to get somebody else in because it's just one item.
You might, yeah, that's very true, but you know, you have to go back to the the idea that if you're having to add something to a historic building, you're going to need listed building consent.
Yeah, you still have to make an application for it.
You have to make an application, and that part of that application is basically you have to justify and you have to show that you understand the setting and the building or whatever, and that you're working with the grain of the building. So in that sense, you know, whilst it's perfectly possible for, you know, non sort of professionals to do that, and sometimes it's even better that they do that, that's for sure. You know, if it's a very specific thing, it's actually relatively straightforward. But if it gets quite complicated, where, you know, something's a bit more integrated and there's a bit more nuanced, then perhaps you need a little bit wider spectrum of experience.
I think part of that, yeah, if you're installing one piece, it's going to be maybe more straightforward, but you know, it really depends on the application that you have to make to get the permission, and that's where you might find you need the expertise, even if it is just fixing one piece of new ironwork, which I think is what the question is related to. I'm not sure. We have one more question, and then I think we're going to go for we're going to go back to James. So, why is it that specialist ironwork designers, blacksmiths, are frequently not included in the design stages of a project? Now, this is right up my street. This really is. I can relate to this completely. On a number of, I'll give an example here, on a number of projects, I will be given a design to work with. Actually, Ely Cathedral was one. I was given a concept, but I very much worked with the designer, and I added the technical expertise, and I added the craftsmanship to that design, and I had a two-way conversation, and we worked on the design and we developed it. But quite often what I get presented with, and where I think this question is coming from, I get presented with a design, and I'm said, can you make this please? And I'm said maybe they want it as craftsmen involved with it and they want the technical side, but I look at it knowing ironwork design, and I look at it aesthetically on the possibilities with the medium, and I look at it technically, obviously, and I look at it from the materials point of view, what it's good to do with certain materials or not. And I think it needs, I think it needs work to make it sing. I think you can improve it. But at no stage prior to being given the concept has anybody thought about getting a specialist designer in for it. I mean, to be frank, some of the designs you come up with, it looks like the new boy in the office has designed it, especially when it comes to a scrollwork design. So why is it? And quite often some of these designs come from committees. So it'll have gone through a committee procedure, several committee meetings to get agreements. And so nobody has the stomach for going back to the committee to get another tweak or variation on the design approved. So Rhys, I think I'm sort of jumping in on this one, but I think what the question is why do people, architects then, design ironwork without consulting someone who knows about the medium or an artist in the material?
I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, you may have put your finger on it when you said it passed the lowest person in the office. I mean, I think the thing is that you've got to remember that architecture is a very three-dimensional problem-solving exercise, which may involve thousands of decisions, all very spatial. And when you get down to something like ironwork, rightly or wrongly, it's possibly seen as quite two-dimensional. So just because it's generally it is planar, not always, obviously, but you know. So as a consequence, it sort of gets sort of, you know, anyone can have a crack at it sort of attitude, which is obviously not right, you know. But I feel that that's probably why. There's also a lot of ignorance. I think there's a lot of people who are very ignorant about, you know, the subtleties of metalwork. Obviously, you know, we have a different work ethic, if you like. We always consult with the people that are doing the work, because at the end of the day, it's a collaborative process. They'll know more about certain aspects of, you know, the fabrication than we will ever know, but we'll know perhaps a lot more about the backstory of the design. So working together, you tend to get a much better result, as you found out at Ely. I think it just the committee thing, I don't really know. I mean, I think that the trouble is a lot of metalwork, I think, is commissioned for ecclesiastical situations and ecclesiastical or national trust situations, or those large bodies which are very heavily committee based. And I think therein lies the problem, because no one person is taking control and saying, actually, no, that needs to be passed out to somebody who knows what they're talking about. I think that's probably the root cause of the problem, is that, PCCs and
yeah, because
can I step in? Can I step in at this point? I just say we've reached the end of our sort of allotted time, but there are questions backing up, and I suggest that we take another 2 fairly quick questions before bringing this to a close. So, would you like to pick?
Like to pick, right? So I think we'll just finish that one off. I think Rhys, your answer was that you don't know why they don't get an expert in at an earlier stage, but it is something that you would do because you work in a collaborative process when you're going towards it. I mean, partly because possibly because modern architecture is fairly Lego based in lots of senses. There are also a lot of very, very good designers. A lot of stuff is just picked from catalogues. Because it's a very product run industry now. So, even your plastering comes as a board, So I think there's a mentality has grown up that actually, that people don't, especially architects or a lot of designers, don't really understand that craftspeople still exist and have a skill to apply. And I think that's, possibly bad education, but I think it's also possibly due to the complexity of modern buildings. They're just so complicated. There's literally thousands and thousands of decisions you have to make. Yeah, well, I think what it is obviously being an ironwork specialist. I mean, I have a term for the work that I do as jewellery for buildings. So I often see it as, it's the icing on the cake. It's the last decorative element. It's, sometimes a focal point. So it's a shame when I'm given something to work with that I can't make sing as best as it can and make it, the best of the opportunity. Anyhow, we shall move on to the next question. So, right, there's one person coming in. It's saying, I have trouble finding people with the right skills. Is there a shortage of artist craftsmen? Personally, I don't think there is. If we're talking, let's take this to blacksmiths, because we're talking about ironwork tonight. I think you need to know potentially where to look and how to find them. There's 2 questions in here. One is the artist and one is the craftsman. If it's hands-on people making the craft, well, there's a really good training in this country for people coming through, new people, new blood into the trade. So as for blacksmiths, obviously it isn't a huge trade. There's about 4 colleges which teach, Hereford being the largest. You got Plimpton, Marscroft, and I think there's one called Oakridge in Scotland. So you've got people coming into the trade and they are teaching traditional blacksmithing skills. But the thing with the question is talking about finding somebody, I don't know how you find this, Rhys, but you probably find someone and stick with them, don't you?
Yes, I mean, I have sympathy with this question because I know exactly where the person's coming from who's asked it, because it is very difficult sometimes to find the right level of craftsperson. And even in Bath, where you would think there's hundreds of really good masons, there are surprisingly few who are really highly skilled. It just comes down to experience. You've just got to, I mean, unfortunately, one of the things I think that is a problem is that the way that projects are tendered, and that you don't have the ability to necessarily find the craftsman in advance, and that does lead to all kinds of problems. So what we've started to do is we'll invite 3 or 4 craftspeople, and we'll pay them a sum of money to do exemplars, and that way, say for example, just do a trial of this, a trial of that, whatever it happens to be. And that way you can actually see the crafts. The thing is with historic buildings and any sort of traditional skills, it is very much whatever I say as an architect is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, the person who makes the final decision and makes the building sing or not sing, as you put it, is the person at the end of the trowel, the person doing the work. And whilst I can have an umbrella view of that, I can't control the instantaneous decision-making process, which those people have gained through, decades, obviously, of skills and honing their craft.
I think with blacksmiths, there's definitely a cohort coming through year on year of people training with traditional skills, because that is what the traditional skills are what they're learning. But the thing is, unless they practice them, they don't keep them.
Yeah.
You've got to be on the job practicing. Yeah. So they might know them in theory and be capable, but to be very, very good, you've just got to be using them day in, day out. And in fairness to the craftsmen, there often isn't always a run of jobs which are that well paid enough to have that level of skill invested in them.
Or the architects don't push them enough. So we have a job where we recently worked with a guy, and he spent his life laying block work, and he was clearly quite good at laying block work, but we started getting him laying stone and brick, and he'd never been confronted with laying brick and lime mortar. So he said, well, okay, off you go, you have a play and see. And he just got the bit between his teeth. He said, what, you mean I don't have to lay 1,000 blocks a day or whatever it happened to be? He said, no, you just have a play. And he turned out to be an absolutely exceptional craftsman, but he just didn't know it because he'd spent his time just doing something very mundane. But that was giving him the ability to show what he could do and to explore. And that took a lot of courage from the client, because I said to the client, this guy is potentially very, very good. So everyone's got a skill somewhere, but they just have to eke it out, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to come in with a different angle on this one though. I think sometimes though contemporary work or a contemporary design is seen as an excuse for poor quality workmanship. It's just, oh, let's just fabricate and weld it together. It's contemporary, it doesn't matter. And they don't actually put the craftsmanship into the build quality. I think I've seen that on projects. So the design could have been very good, but it was like cheapened in the making stage, whether that's cheapened by the client and the budget, or they just didn't find the right craftsperson to apply that to it.
I think it comes back to the previous question, which is actually designers and fabricators or craftspeople not working together, because actually when you work together, you can discuss things and you can see the options, etc. And that's a way of both educating each other of our own limitations and what other people can do. And that's really, I think, vitally important. And it's one of my pet hates is when you get people say, that's going to be done that way because that's the way I want it done. Actually, it's not a good way to design. It's not a good way to communicate. It's certainly not a good way to get a good result. You need to be collaborative because, everyone has got something to bring to the table.
My best projects have been collaborative with the architect. The architect's overseeing the overall building place, and I'm just doing one detail within it. But it's being able to work with them and make sure you're on the right track. Going back to that question, it did say about artists, craftsmen. One of the things is I've met with some artists is they're very much focused on doing their thing and their design. It's a different mindset when you're working in a conservation area, heritage setting. You're designing in a different way. It's not about making this big statement that is my piece, my work, almost like a sculpture that you're putting in. You're working in a different way to get the right design for both the architectural context and for the client. So craftsman is one in the making and two, their design skills. And there's also another point with this is that a lot of the people coming out of college, their aspirations, because I know this was when I came out of university, was to be a designer, craftsperson, contemporary. It wasn't, to design in a traditional fashion or to design for heritage. It wasn't something that came on my horizon. Then I've come round to that, and I think I do that quite well. But it's a different way of thinking from those artists. I think we should probably see if there's another one. Is there another question? I've lost track of.
In your experience, is there a common issue linking inappropriate design proposals? That's the last question, I believe. Do you see that one?
Yes, I see that. Thank you for working your way down to the bottom to see that. I'm going to jump in into the point on that one, and Reese, and I think it's about designing for the context. We've been talking tonight about designing for the architecture as well as the client, you know, the character of the place. And I think the one thing that doesn't work in designs is when you forget to take that character into consideration.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's basically, I would actually put it as simple as ignorance. So if you're just sort of, if you're demonstrating you haven't understood the context you're working in, then that's the link. It's just, the question is, what are there any common issues linking inappropriate design? It's just ignorance of setting, ignorance of what it is you're working with, the environment you're working in. I
think you mentioned earlier, wasn't it, about Bath? There's different areas in Bath. So you have the Royal Crescent. It's very prim, very proper, very, I'm going to use the word classical, you'll correct me on that.
Yeah, yeah.
But then you've also got the industrial areas and things like that, or more the workman areas, you know, where the industry was and things. So you're not going to take a design like you'd find up at the Royal Crescent and plonk it in the middle of an industrial area, are you?
No, there are 16 different, you know, where Bath looks like a homogeneous bit of cheddar. You know, it's all the same sort of colour, it's all roughly the same texture, etc. There are 16 distinctive areas which are very different characters. Subtle, the character, and it's almost every 10 years of the evolution of the city, there was a different sort of character of building. So, you know, and this is what sort of you need to understand when you're dealing with historic buildings and historic settings. And if you don't demonstrate, going back to the question, if you can't demonstrate, you know, it's a much more satisfactory result for yourself if you feel that, oh, I've sorted this out, I've cracked it, I know this fits, it works, it really does fit in. You know, but if you just apply something generic, or you don't sort of, and that's generally what's happening when they're inappropriate design proposals are generic. They're not contextual at all.
Well, I think what it is people, for example, buy a building plot, and that might be in Bath, but and the building plot's in the by the way, for the delegates, we're talking about Bath because Reese is based in Bath. That's why we're talking about Bath tonight rather than York.
It's the same in Edinburgh, same in York, same in anywhere.
Yeah, but it's the same. Yes, exactly. So you take the building plot. You couldn't get the building plot right next to Royal Crescent where you wanted to build your nice, prim, proper classical house. You've got it in the middle of the industrial area, but you want a prim, proper classical house. The problem is that you can't it's not appropriate to put that in the middle of an industrial area. So, you know, something being client-led like that and saying, but this is what I want, isn't what responds in a conservation setting to the actual surroundings.
I suppose an analogy would be, if you can imagine a tailor, as people, as artisans, you know, people out there party to this conversation, a lot of them are very, very highly skilled craftspeople. And it's almost like tailoring a bespoke suit. You know, you respond to the body you're fitting it to. And that's what your conservation officer or whoever, that's basically equivalent to like the heritage setting. If you turn up with an MNS or I don't know, whatever standardized, you know, one size fits all suit, you know, it's not going to be received at all well, because especially if you're like me, slightly a weird shape, you know, the suit doesn't fit, it's a bit tight, it's a bit awkward. It perhaps would need a more bespoke sort of cut. So that's sort of where things go wrong, and that's where designs become inappropriate, where you're just trying to apply something standard and not considered to something which is definitely not standard. And the thing is, with historic buildings, there's no two buildings are the same, no two settings are the same. They're all very, very unique. So you have to learn to read and adapt to those settings.
So
I'm going to jump in there, if I may, and we've reached, I think, the end of the session, and I hope you've all found that as fascinating as I have. We have lots and lots of questions that we haven't been able to answer, but I think we've probably given it a fair crack this evening. We're going to be holding two further First Tuesdays webinars, one on the 11th of August and the next on the 8th of September. The one on the 11th of August, that's been confirmed as Andrew Arroll, an architect who will be taking us through some of the challenges involved in the work taking place currently at Notre Dame. So I think that will be a very fascinating session, and I hope that many of you will feel like joining us for that. And it just remains for me really to thank Bethan and Reese. Thank also Adrian, who is sort of you know, with us in spirit, if not in person. I think you've managed to sustain the conversation very well, given that it's two of you rather than three of you. But those have been really interesting contributions. Bethan, your presentation was fascinating in itself, and it's been really illuminated and brought to life by the discussion between you and Rhys. So on that, I'd like to thank everybody on the line virtually who've been joining us this evening. Thank you for being with us, and good night to you all. Good night.